Welcome to MAGICademy podcast. Today with us is Ross Stevenson. He is the chief learning strategist and founder of a strategy consulting firm called Still These Thoughts. A very controversial name for a strategy firm. We will dig deeper into his founding stories and how he come up with this name for this company. He will share with us the what he called the AI decision operating system, a set of protocol of questions to guide us make key decisions when we are thinking about implementing AI in the learning development space. We'll dig deeper into the impact on productivity by AI tools, where it shines, where it really hurts. We'll also dig into the ethical considerations of AI tools and other emerging technologies that's coming up in our space. And we'll also dig into the magic of Ross. So let's wait no further and let's start.
I've been working in the, let's call it L&D/people industry for nearly 2 decades now, which makes me feel really old when I actually say that back in a live setting. But been focusing on kind of a 360 of the people in the L&D world, more specifically the last, let's say 15 years. I've really been involved in kind of learning technology, deploying that, implementing that, maximizing it, making it work for companies who are spending lots of money on it. I have worked all the way from huge corporations with 350,000 plus people doing insane, chaotic projects, all the way to working with scale up organizations in the tech scene in the UK and US, and also working with startups. And nowadays, I ply my trade. I suppose you can call me one of these solopreneurs, which is the trendy word at the moment, I suppose, where I work with L&D teams, L&D professionals individually, and companies, mostly on improving workforce performance through technology. So in a bit of a nutshell, that's who I am and what I do.
Excellent. And the first time I came across your work, it's your branding your work saying like steal these thoughts. I'm like, oh, what does that mean? Steal these thoughts. It comes a little bit like interestingly to me. And can you share with us like what's the kind of the behind the scenes stories that inspired this particular idea?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the first thing is I've always been a builder or a creator of stuff. So I've had loads of since I was young, like blogs and websites and other stuff that I built. I was always kind of quite a curious chap. And still these thoughts really came around because I wanted to build something where I could fundamentally, and this was in my mind at the point where I built it, have a plan B if anything went wrong in my normal career. If there was unfortunate people experience with redundancies or disability, how do I have something that's kind of in the back end to help me? But also on the side of that was the fact that I like to write. And at the time I created Still These Thoughts, it's like a decade ago now, I was doing a lot of work in the digital learning space. I was speaking at conferences and I get loads of inbound messages from people, which is great, but asking me loads of questions about how was I doing what I was doing. And I just couldn't get to all those people. It just wasn't possible for me to do that on an individual basis. And I kind of felt pretty bad about that. So I was like, why don't I just capture all of the thoughts that I have on this stuff and just put it into a newsletter that if people can read, it's free, they can do whatever. I didn't want to call it, the Ross Stevenson newsletter or the Ross Stevenson experience, something like that. I just didn't want my name attached to it because I was like, oh, I feel a bit weird about it being called by my name. So Still These Thoughts came around purely from a number of influences. So one of them being from a band I listened to when I was younger called System of a Down. They had a very famous album cover that you can Google, which is called Still This Album. And it was just a white background and it just said Still This Album, and it was in a CD store. And I was like, wow, that is like very good marketing and positioning, because it stood out among the sea of everything. You just saw this thing that said Still This Album. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And then there was another element of, I've been reading a couple of books by a chap called Austin Kleon, and he had a book called Still Like an Artist and another book called Show Your Work. And they were very influential at the time on what I was thinking of doing, because the premise of those books was basically like, there are kind of no original ideas. Everyone's kind of doing the same stuff, iterating on the same bits. And if you want to get an original idea down people's kind of throats, you have to say it 1,000 times in 1,000 different ways. And the best way to connect with people is also just to show your work. It's just to be out there and showing your work. What are you doing? Learning from other people and doing that. So build stuff together, learn from each other. And that was it. That was where it started like 7 years ago. And now I sit here where I go to conferences and people don't even say my name. They will shout, steal these thoughts at me. Or, it's a weird thing that I experience. So yeah, that's how it came around and how it kind of exists today because of those influences. So it had very, I suppose, small scale, humble beginnings.
Yeah, and I think still these thoughts, I think it also taps into the social learning theory where we are always, no matter whether we are aware of it or not, we're always building upon each other's thoughts, and also it comes up with very kind of generous sense of it. It's like, yeah, go ahead and take in and help this knowledge evolve, like collective knowledge to evolve. So I like how this like paint a picture of collective growth and flourishing and development in this space.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's great. And now let's talk some business here. AI has been like, people has been talking about AI nonstop, and I think it's gonna come. Not I think it will stay, and it will potentially transform and evolve the learning development space and among any other industry. And you were talking about, when we were in our first conversation, you were talking about a operating system. When you were talking about AI and application, you have to build an operating system. Can you elaborate on this a little bit? By what do you mean by operating system here?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll try and keep this very top level, but there's obviously multiple layers that kind of sit within this. So when we speak about AI, so I'm going to focus on specifically generative AI, because AI and generative AI are huge on their own. And if we take an example of conversational AI tools, so ChatGPT, Perplexity, Google Gemini now, not Bard, which are large language models, which are conversational AI tools. I think what we can look at in terms of a operating system is fundamentally saying, how can we not only understand this technology, but how can we leverage it and maximize it at a local level in our teams? And how can we do that at a company-wide level as well, that fits into the context of what we do as a business, of what we're trying to achieve? So when I think about an operating system, it is really that anyone can pick up and go, here is a set of guiding principles that I can investigate and use to help me get to that North Star of to your point, we know generative AI is here to stay. So how do we want that technology to play a part in whatever you look at as performance, as productivity, as growth? How does that sit? So that's the main idea behind the operating system, is to kind of go forward with that. Doesn't have to be L&D specific. You could use it for kind of any kind of company, but it's general principles in terms of not necessarily you must think this way, but it's like, here's some ideas on how to think about generative AI in this space, and to inspire people to, for me personally, look beyond a lot of the social media gimmicks that we see at the moment, and think more, I hate using the word, but it's probably the best word for it, but it's to think a bit more strategically and intelligently about, how does this play a part in my career, my company, my life?
And is there any particular like critical component that goes into this operating system, like the framework? If we were to kind of, in the next 1 minute, quickly build our operating system, what are some key elements or key questions that we should think through?
Yeah, 100%. So I can give you a bunch of critical questions which you can kind of take away and really think on and kind of iterate for what you're doing. So I think the first thing to look at is definitely, how will any generative AI technology complement what you have today? And the reason why I say this is because we all have many different apps, access to technology. I did a talk for learning technologies in London a few years ago, where I'd done some huge research and found out that the average employee has 88 applications at their disposal every day. So that's a lot of choice. That's a lot of decision fatigue. If you're going to introduce something new, what are you taking away? How are you adding that in? So I think it's really thinking about generative AI tools are still a tool in your toolkit, and how do they complement what you have? And then, of course, around that, going back to the local level and the company-wide level, you want to think about, well, why this tool for the task that we're talking about? And we'll talk more about this in our conversation, where I'm very much task focused on never go for the tool first, always thinking about what is the problem you're trying to solve? What are the tasks within that problem? And can X tool help you with that? And then a few more quick questions are around, can a human without AI do this better than what you're looking at? You have to ask that question, because it's not the silver bullet. It's not the answer to everything. It might feel like that right now, the way some sources are talking about, but there's still very much a huge human component on that. And then I think from a business-wide level, you need to be asking questions around, how should you prepare your organization for the impact of AI tools, whether that's across your L&D team, whether that's across your organization in general. And then on top of that, with that introduction and integration, how can you foster an effective human AI collaboration in that learning and performance process? Because it's one thing to, I'm going to buy some tools, but how do I still bring together the human elements and the AI elements to make sure that we can perform, how we need to be? And then the last thing, which is more around, looking at a long-term view of operating system, is how can you ensure that what you're doing today is scalable? Because I think if we look at some AI tools now, they're probably not going to exist in the next few years. I'd say there's probably 99% of the stuff out there currently is pretty rubbish. There's about 1% that's really, really good and will stick around and will be ingrained. And I think it's really key for, leaders of any business to think about, is this scalable? Are we just jumping into the hype, or are we thinking more intelligently around how do we do this in the long term? And for me, that's the whole kind of emphasis of the operating system, is to encourage those discussions and encourage that deeper thinking to make sure that A, you can make smarter decisions, and B, you are focused on doing that for the right reasons, not just because so-and-so company has a case study with this tool and it looks amazing, and you want to do that because you want to say on LinkedIn, we've bought 10 AI tools. Do you know what I mean? That's the kind of like trend nowadays. But of course, everything I say in terms of those questions, I have to say that context matters. So it's all very contextual. You can take those questions and look at it against your specific context. And I wouldn't say these are set in stone. These are really just what I look at as guiding questions to get that ball rolling, and then look at, okay, so how are we going to build our own operating system in? How do, we as a company want to approach this? Because some people will have the same approach. Many will have different approaches in terms of what works for them. So yeah, that's the real goal. And I say those are the critical questions for me up front on what I would advise.
I think this is very helpful. I think it's not only applying to L&D world, it can also apply for the bigger world out there. As kind of the foundational key questions to ask, no matter where you are, what stage you are, senior, junior, whatever. Just if you are thinking, as long as you're thinking about AI and its impact, this is the key question you should ask yourself. And when you're talking about like different context, can you give us some examples of what specifically are you referring to? What are some specific contexts that typically stand out that applies to people?
Yeah, so I think the easiest one when it comes to context is, and the reason why I talk about context quite often if I take a step back, is because, like most people, I get very allured and excited around methodologies and new frameworks and tools that come out online. And I love it when people talk about saying, you must do this and this is how you must do it. But unfortunately, the world doesn't kind of work like that, because someone saying that who works for a billion-dollar organization, has all the resources in the world, and has a great amount of freedom, doesn't really line up if I work in a scale up with 400 people and I have no one in my team and my budget is $5,000. So the contextual bit is more around how do I make that work for my world? So a prime example of that, if we build upon what I just said, is when we look at, and I'll take the specificity of generative artificial intelligence in L&D, is that I'm in conversations continuously around, content creation is usually the big use case that people immediately think of because it's the simplest. It seems like the one that's kind of pushed quite often, and that makes sense. It's easy to discount that, and I've discounted that, many times with companies. But if we think about that from two different sides of the coin, if you work for an enterprise organization where, let's say, you've got 20,000 people in that organization, your L&D budget is a multi-million pound budget, you have a team of 30 people, actually content creation is probably not going to be a huge impact for you, really. And again, that depends on your context, how good. I'm hoping the quality of the content you produce today is all really good, but I don't think there's going to be huge gains there. And I think you still kind of really want to, as much as possible, navigate that through a human aspect. But you flip to the other side of that. If you go speak to a person, as I was saying previously, in a scale-up organization, they're an L&D professional on their own. They don't really have any budget, and they need to do this stuff. They haven't got the time. They haven't got the resources. Then a conversational AI tool that can build content at speed and certain quality becomes incredibly attractive, and it becomes incredibly impactful, which makes it a big use case for that person. So the context matters, because for that individual, it is impactful. But for the other individual in the enterprise organization, it's not. It's a bit more gimmicky. It's not a big return on investment for what that organization's looking for. So I always cover this, because I think when you go to conferences and you hear from these big organizations, you have to take that from a pinch of salt, and you have to think about, where are you now in your career and your company? What resources do you have available to you at this moment? And what can you achieve? Because I think it's very easy in our industry to beat ourselves up because someone said you should go buy 400 ChatGPT licenses and do all this stuff. So contextually, I think that's a classic example of scale ups versus enterprise organizations. But you could even see those differences at the same level. So you could have one enterprise organization from let's say, a technology and learning maturity perspective that are very capable of scaling and wielding generative AI tools in an intelligent way. And you might have another enterprise organization that seems the same on the surface, but beneath it doesn't have the same organizational maturity and learning maturity to do these things. So it is all around investigating that context for you and then adapting it for your world.
Yeah, and also you talked about like potentially, because the learning development space, it's all about helping organizations to achieve a particular outcome. No matter if you're in like corporate world or even higher ed world or even other learning development world, it's always going to be a business outcome. And then learning development is kind of like augmentation or enhancement, helping talent people to reach that particular outcome. Would you like, in terms of this alignment, what are some general strategies when we're thinking about the AI's role, how that plays into this powerful alignment between talent and outcome?
Yeah, so I think actually there's many views in this at the moment. I think one that I resonate with quite a lot is from LinkedIn's CEO, Ryan Roslansky. And he released an article, it must be about 14 months ago now. So it's probably just before we hit peak ChatGPT and the whole world was going mad over it, where the article was called Redefining Work. And he spoke in depth around how do we look at this, not potential problem at that point, but how do we look at how does this help improvement? And he spoke a lot around looking at tasks, which I quite like as well. But I also look at, probably maybe the next level to that is for anyone who's looking to align with this, is that how do you look at the problems you've got? What are the problems you're trying to solve? And essentially working backwards to say, what are the tasks in that problem that I could get help with from a generative AI perspective? And then you can ladder that up to say, well, if I could use AI to enhance me in this bit, this bit, and this bit, that allows me to solve that problem, that then the problem being solved then means that we're able to achieve that business outcome, hopefully in better quality and at speed than what you expected it to be. So I always think about, and I look at this from a general tech perspective, not just an AI perspective. Anything you're looking at is, getting your problem definition down and interrogating on what is it we're trying to solve here, and making sure everyone's aligned. And then looking at, well, underneath that, to solve that problem, these are the tasks that we need to complete, and this is how we can do it. And the funny thing is, and it's counterintuitive to the conversation we're having now, is that AI may not be the thing that helps with those tasks or in that problem. And data that we've seen in industry reports has shown that in some segments already, which is very interesting. So I think in answer to your question is very much around still making sure you're solving problems, still making sure you're looking at the tasks and not doing what I call the kind of classic mistake of you've gone and bought 2 or 3 tools and then you're trying to find a problem to solve with those tools, which is, to be quite frank, what I spend a lot of my work doing nowadays. Is companies reaching out to me to say, we've spent X amount of money on 3 new tools. How do we use them? What do we use them for? Whereas the conversation should be the complete other way around, where I hope they contact me and say, so we're thinking about doing X. These are the reasons why. Can you help us look at some use cases and what can we help with this from a problem solving perspective? But I've never had that. I've always had we've already bought the tool. We've signed the license for 2 years. Now we need to do this critical thinking work on how do we use that tool to get a return on investment from what we've done. So
I deeply resonate with you on that. I think the world is becoming ever more and more technology focused rather than problem and solution focused. And as we place so much empathy on these technologies, it's inevitably kind of blind us into and distract us from the real problems that we're trying to solve. And by integrating more technologies, we create ourselves more problems to solve. And
100%.
Are these the critical problems we need to solve? Are we taking care of our original problems? So it's a rabbit hole right there. I totally agree. And was there any particular process? Because you mentioned about figuring the problem out, and I feel like figuring out the problem is the key then. And what would be the effective process to kind of help them figure out the problem first and then seek out the solution? Is there any questions that people should ask, like template questions people should ask?
Yeah, definitely. So there's probably a simple analysis thing you can do, and I use this as well when I talk about performance consulting at L&D with stakeholders. Is when you get into a room, it's basically like, why are we here? What are we trying to solve? And you can do this in 2 ways. You can do this on your own if you're solving a problem that you've got specifically and you're trying to look at AI support for that. But if you're doing it with others, it's essentially asking a series of questions to look at, well, what is the specific issue that you're having barriers to right now? So what is the blocker that's stopping you from doing X task that you need to do in order to hit a performance or revenue or growth goal? And then there's classic frameworks, which you can find online. One I really love is called the 5 Whys, which is quite a popular one, which it sounds a bit strange when you first read it, because it basically just tells you to keep asking why 5 times and breaking down. But if you see the examples of it in terms of, it gets people to think more deeply around, someone might come and saying to you, I've got a training requirement in my team because they give terrible feedback. And then you might say to them, well, why are they giving terrible feedback? And then the next part that the manager might go, well, we don't really get together that often, so we don't know each other that well. It's like, well, why don't you talk to each other that often and have that connection? And then it kind of goes down as you keep kind of breaking that down. And essentially what you're doing is you're kind of in a way coaching people to their own answers. So you get to this point where you start to kind of chip away the marble and you start to find out, well, what's the root cause that is actually creating most of the issues here for people? And it's the same with technology. I've had many conversations where people have come to me and said, we need this tool because I need to do X task. And then my question will be, well, why do you need to do X task? And they'll say, because it helps us do this. I'm like, why does it help you do that? Well, because we need to do this. I'm like, so what's your process right now? And then they'll go through a talk about their process. And I'll say to them, so what tools are you using currently to do that? And they'll go through a tool set. And then we'll start to talk about, well, what's the barrier in those tools today that doesn't allow you to solve this problem? And then 9 times out of 10, they'll usually go, I don't know. I usually say to them, well, have you investigated what else this tool can do? And they're like, no, not really. But I've seen this thing online and it says it can do it. So I was thinking we could just bring this in and then, get rid of that because it's not doing what I want to do. And what you can see is that you start to paint a picture of these people and you start to kind of get to the crux of, well, is the actual issue lying in we need more technology with tools to support us? Or does it lie in the fact that we haven't actually done the investigation to understand what the problem is and actually can we fix that problem in what we've got at the moment in time? So I call them, and I've got free resources online where people can use to get these, but I think using something like the 5 whys framework, get into the crux of that problem. And although it is annoying because you sound like a 5-year-old saying the same question over and over again, just breaking down the levels of why are people thinking that way? What's leading them to think that way? Because it's very easy for us to have perceptions or assumptions or bias towards that person is thinking that because of X. But you don't actually know until you ask the question, because it may take you completely off guard. And they may have a completely different viewpoint that you were not aware of at all. And you've made an assumption which is incorrect. So that's why it's incredibly important to kind of have those conversations, which is a very human thing to do, which is where the human AI collaboration is very interesting, because sending them something on a conversational AI tool is not going to do that, because you need to be there with someone to understand the environment they're in, the culture, the mannerisms at the time, how they feel about the questions, and work through there. So I'm not saying that's easy. It's not going to be easy for all people to do that. But I think there's nothing more powerful to get to the crux of what is it we're solving for than literally sitting there and probably not trying to sound like a therapist, but asking a bunch of questions where you just want to understand better why do they think this way, and then help them, get to the problem, which is either to validate it is a problem, or it's to say, well, it's not a problem, but what can we do instead?
I think I really appreciate how you kind of connect the 5 whys to the curiosity perspective. I think that's where the curiosity really has an impact in a bigger space. And if everyone within the organization, wherever you are, activate that sort of like curiosity, maybe we will be less distracted by technology, but more focused on the real problems, the day-to-day challenges, the bigger goals. It's very insightful. So you also talked about a BCG report about, there are some increased productivity, there are some decreased productivity when they're using AI. What are some tasks that people have been seeing increased productivity versus tasks that people are seeing decreased productivity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think some of this may not come as a surprise to some people, or for some people it might come as a surprise, who knows. But I mean, what was really interesting about the report is that, so BCG did this in conjunction with Harvard. So, two pretty reputable names that people know, basically saying that we're going to look at how large language models potentially impact performance at work. So there was a couple of things that happened. They looked at tasks that they pretty were sure AI could enhance, and they looked at tasks that they didn't think AI could enhance, or maybe even been detrimental. So the tasks that really had a lot of performance were what I'd like to call kind of mostly low to mid risk tasks. So what I mean by that is, if you get them wrong, it's not going to be brand detrimental. It's not going to cost millions or billions of pounds. What the report found with their consultants is they were tasks like generating ideas, data analysis with different reports, writing marketing copies, writing persuasive emails to co-workers or to line managers to get support for ideas. So they may not set the world on fire, those tasks, but they are very commonplace tasks that we all do every day. And what they found was that, especially for the low skilled workers, or novice employees, should we say, is that with the use of a conversational AI tool, which in this report was ChatGPT, they actually experience a 43% performance improvement when using ChatGPT versus not using. So they had a baseline where they'd already done some of these tasks and said, that's the baseline for these individuals. And then they found a 43% improvement on the baseline. So I think what's really interesting there is that we can definitely see many different opportunities to look at how do we enhance what we do with these tools. And then not just enhance, but especially if we look at people who sit in the more junior or novice employees bracket, how can we help them learn to do these things better? So it's not that they have to keep going back and using the AI tool. Maybe once they've worked with that tool a number of times, they'll get better at data analysis themselves. They get better at generating ideas. It doesn't mean a reliance on it all the time. So those are, I think, and we'll see in other reports as well, those are the common kind of performance outcomes that people are getting at the moment in time.
Where do they see decreased productivities?
Yes. So this is really good to talk about because there are limitations. Although in the social media world, you'd think generative AI is going to save the world and cure cancer or do all this kind of stuff. It's got limitations, opportunities and limitations. So I think what we do see, and it's a really great part of the report, which is too long for me to recite here in its entirety, but what they talk about is a task that they knew the consultants could do very well, because that's essentially what they're trained for, but they thought with AI support might potentially struggle. And a lot of that was down to the critical thinking elements and analytical judgment of a human versus a pre-trained generative model and what that was working on. So what actually happened, and I'm just reminding myself as I look at my screen here, is that they were given a task where, and it was a huge task where they were talking about working with a CEO of a fictional company, and they needed to give the CEO advice on how do I grow different elements of my distribution. And the data they were given for that is to say, here's some internal interviews from our organization, here's some financial analytics that we've got on the company, and they needed to use that to actually inform the CEO, what could they do. But where it gets interesting is that the request was quite specific. So that was the top line. And then the consultants were asked to do a number of things with AI. So they were asked to propose distribution channels they would select for this CEO. Why would they do that? They needed to then explain their rationale of doing this with that data. They needed to then, on top of that, suggest tactical actions that would boost growth in the next 6 months. I think those things for generative artificial intelligence is very hard. unless it has that human context. And if you're going to do that, it's going to be better for you to do that as a human because you have that context instead of spending time trying to get an artificial intelligence tool to understand that context for you. So unfortunately, in that part of the experiment, what they actually saw was a 19% decrease on performance on that task when using AI. And a lot of that comes down to because generative AI is a probability engine, if you look at it that way. So it's very probabilistic. And what it tries to do is basically say, if I've got a gap in my knowledge, I'll just make stuff up. I'll find a source elsewhere because my end goal is to please the user, is to make sure the user gets an answer. It's not for it to turn around and say, well, I don't know. It's for it to say, I'm going to give you an answer. So it becomes dangerous in that fact that if you're trying to give very, and again, this goes back to the risk level of the task, I'd call this a high risk level task, because if you give the wrong advice, interpret the data incorrectly, and give wrong actions to take, that's incredibly costly from a brand perspective, from a relationship perspective, and from a growth perspective. So leaving that fundamentally in the hands of artificial intelligence is a very scary thing, where it's not able to, as I say, call upon that critical thinking or analytical judgment and all the information that you have in your mind. So I think there's a couple of ways I look at this. I think one, this is a positive for humans, because what it says to me is that generative AI can most certainly not do all tasks. And the tasks where we do really need to deploy our most human skills of adaptability, critical thinking, analytical judgment, emotional intelligence, all those things, it just cannot be replicated in that tool. So for me, I like that because that's pretty good. But it also demonstrates the fact that, highly skilled people who have context in their organization are going to continue to be really valued. Yes, they can get some enhancement from generative AI tools, but that's still the main goal. So even if you are a junior person that's using generative AI, and yes, you are progressing quickly, there is going to be a limit on that, because you'll get to a point in your career where it's, well, actually, you need to rely on your human intelligence, and you can enhance that with AI, of course, but you will need to rely on human intelligence to focus on high risk tasks versus low risk and mid-level tasks. But as I say, I personally like that, and I'm comfortable with that, because AI is not a replacement for us and our work. It should be about how does it help us enhance or even automate some of the low risk and mid risk tasks, so we can focus on those high level tasks, as we explain here. Because if you can get rid of some of the stuff which the report talks about in terms of writing marketing copy, data analysis, writing emails, and that's going to allow you to really focus deeply on working with a CEO of a major organization in terms of strategic actions on revenue growth and distribution channels, I think really that is a win overall. So I think in some great opportunities, but yeah, we really need to be aware of there is limitations. And as proven in this report, if you try to use AI to do that task, it can actually end up performing worse than if you did it on your own. So I think there's a lot to chew on and a lot for people to consider when they implement that in their organizations.
And it's, when it boils down, it really is kind of saying, depending on what kind of information that's available in the database that the AI is, as they generate probability and probable answers.
100%.
And a lot of organizational contextual information are only stored in human brains, and hard to put it on piece of paper or digitize that sort of information. And the information changes all the time, and
it does.
And it's hard. Yeah, it's hard to always update that database. So this is always the most reliable database that we have
It
here.
is 100%. Yeah, your mind is still. I say this to people all the time. Whenever I say to people, "What's the most powerful tool you have, or what's the most powerful operating system?" they look at me for a while, and some people think I'm talking about digital, but I'm not. I'm always talking about the brain, because all of these things that we're using as tools have been created from a human mind. So for me, the hierarchy of that, the human mind is the superior in all of those tools. And, we shouldn't forget that in the pursuit of, mostly in our society, trying to do things faster, but not necessarily better. So
That's excellent. I think it's also like when we're talking about simple tasks, it could be a good equalizer, helping information to be more accessible. If, say, people who have less experience, they wanted to quickly learn, they could potentially learn it faster, as it relates to basic foundational knowledge. When it comes to more higher level strategic thinking, then it's really based on their experience, their way of critical thinking. That's great. And I think it really plays a big responsibility to every single one of us as an individuals to be the masters of our behaviors, our thoughts, our thinking, put ourselves on that meta above like everything level. As we conclude, so today we talked about the how still these thoughts come about, your stories behind it, the operational system that you advocate when people thinking about applying AI, the strategies we use to align our tasks and learning development with the bigger goal, with the business outcome and goals that we want to achieve. And we also talk about some report from the BCG, things, what AI is really being helpful, what AI is not being really helpful, and the potentiality of AI to become a great equalizer, especially for junior folks who are still trying to learn the foundations. It's important for us to just be the mastermind of everything and stay on top of things. Now let's kind of get into the magic piece as we conclude this talk. What did you enjoy doing when you were 11 or 12 years old?
Yeah, I enjoyed building things. So this probably leads very similar to where I am now. So I'm a complete nerd. So I used to build computers when I was 11, 12. I used to build at that time, which seems sophisticated, but obviously not now, little robots. And you could go to like robotics competitions and such. And I was very interested in coding. So I was always a builder. So I think that's led to where I am now, because a lot of my career has been based on building stuff and translating how to do that stuff to other people. I think that's just a natural progression from being youthful, as in I'm really curious about how to do X, Y, and Z. And I can't think of a time, and I'm 36 now, I can't think of a time that I've ever sat there and gone, I don't think I can understand how to do that. I've always thought I'll learn. Another human, if they breathe oxygen and they have blood, I will figure out how to do this as well. So I've always had that tenacity of I'll do that. So yeah, building's definitely been my thing.
That's great. And did you have to overcome some like life challenges to help you get to where you are now?
Yeah, I think the life challenges is probably where I grew up. So I grew up in a very kind of low social economic area, a very kind of tiny rundown place, where education opportunities weren't very good. I didn't have anyone in my family that had been to kind of any kind of real, what we call nowadays formal education or accreditations or anything like that. So I didn't really have a lot of, I suppose, direction and role models, you want to call that, to say, this is what is possible. This is what you can do. I think I've been very lucky being I suppose, a child of the digital information age, where you could connect with other people. You can see these examples elsewhere. And that kind of built that attitude. And I think that's always been kind of with me in my career, in terms of getting over the challenges of, I suppose, what people may look at as, others have certain advantages because they've been able to go to certain education establishments or get access to stuff because they're part of a certain class in society, where I've always looked at, oh, okay, I didn't have access to that, but how can I catch up? So I might have it now, but I don't look at it as a negative. I look at it as, well, that was a situation then. How do I accelerate? to move there now. So I think one of them is definitely that. And I think the second one, which I probably experience more today, is that I think the transition of the world in the last 10 years in the digital space, in the creation of so many careers and jobs, is a wonderful thing, but it's also a difficult thing to navigate. So as we speak now, I am essentially here's what people look at as a solopreneur. So I have my own one person company where I do my own thing. And that is a relatively new and strange concept to people, because it's always been around: go work for an employer, go do certain things. This is the structure, this is the way. So it's very counterculture and counterintuitive to do that. So I still, on that count, experience challenges on there is a segment of people in our world that do that, but really it's still only a small segment. Even though you see them all online, there's only a couple percentile of the population that are doing that. So it's still understanding, how do you build something where you want to add value, that you really enjoy doing, and that you can bring impact on in a system that's not kind of designed for that, if you want to do your own thing. So I think, yeah, those are things that I've definitely had to navigate, but maybe a better human for having to navigate them, and hence made me better at the things I do.
Yeah. I think the world is changing so fast, and people that I invite to this podcast, most of them are actually building their own initiative, driven by their own passion. And sometimes it's not in total conflict with the traditional way of career and people development. They can go hand together. And I think also your drive of always figuring things out will become more and more valuable, and people will have to, whether voluntarily or not, to start to develop that sort of skill, because it's becoming so unpredictable, and learning how to learn is having the drive and curiosity is becoming a survival
It
thing.
is.
Like
It
it's,
is.
in big organizations also kind of seeing this as an important thing. What do you think is your magic then?
Oh, what do I think is my magic? I think my magic is to, understand complex things quickly, distill them. And I think, in the words of most of the people I've worked for, and I won't use the language they use, but it's to just get stuff done. It's to solve problems and be that person that comes in solving problems. And I think a lot about that now, because I was watching, funny enough, an interview of Barack Obama, and he was giving advice to people that came and worked for him or for other people, big organizations. And he said, be that person that brings in a bunch of solutions. Just, volunteer to solve the problem. Don't sit there and talk about, this is the problem we've got, how are we going to solve this problem? Like, oh, these are all the things that could go wrong. Just get in there and kind of take it, own it, and find that. So long-winded, but yeah, I think my magic is really just picking up things quickly, making sense of them, and deploying them, pretty much.
That's great. I think we're coming to a full loop. It's always about the problem. It's never about the technology. It's always about the problem. It's always solving the problem, making improvements and progress. I guess that's the core of a human evolution. It's
100%,
problem.
Yeah. That's how we survive, right? Survivalism.
Yeah.
We've only been able to survive because we've gone off and done it. So although we're talking about AI, I'm big on a human-powered future. It's got to be that way. We create these tools, we wield these tools, so it's all about humans.
Yeah, empowerment. That's great. It's such a great talk and discussion with you, Ross, and thank you so much for sharing such a deep felt insights in our conversation, in our time and space here. I'm very grateful to have you here.